there's so many ways that we're trying to say no without saying, the actual word no. And I think when we realize that as human beings, we realize that if anything, you want someone's what I call empowered yes more than you want anything else. It's like, do you really want to do this? Are you sure you're okay with doing this? There's those checking in where you could make sure like I have someone who fully wants to be in this with me rather than someone who I'm okay kind of overlooking all the other, signals that say this.
Welcome back to Raising Men. Now, one of the superpowers that we need to instill in our boys, even our girls, especially our girls maybe, is the idea of establishing and respecting boundaries. So joining us today is Tiffany Braxton. She's an author, an activist, and an educator. And as a mother of 4 children and a survivor herself, Tiffany has dedicated her work to transforming heavy, often intimidating conversations into approachable, life-changing tools. Her debut book, Consent Comics, utilizes vivid, layered storytelling to teach youth, parents, and educators about personal power, honest communication, and respect. Tiffany, welcome to Raising Men.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited about our conversation. Really love this podcast and the focus. So I appreciate the invite.
Oh, thank you so much. I think that a lot of concepts that you'd think would be totally uncontroversial,
Mhm.
the topic of consent has gotten overloaded
It is,
with a lot
yeah.
of baggage in a way that I think is really unhelpful. What do you see as some of the problems we're facing when trying to cultivate a respect for boundaries in our boys and young men?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is it is not at all approachable or welcoming to men and boys. I mean, it's literally why in my book you just get into a few pages and I have a letter to the guys.
Yeah.
Because, I didn't want to wait to say, hey, you're welcome. This was an invitation to you as well, and not just to what consent teaching typically is, which is usually more so for women and girls. This is so much more than just that. And, I have to shout out the men in my life that I really love that made it so that I couldn't, ignore, the quote unquote half of the population
Yeah.
in my approach to consent. I have a wonderful father who raised me to be, a young woman who used her voice and was strong along the way. And, I thank him for that. And, as a survivor coming back to my voice, I went straight to him. He was my biggest support. I'm close to my mom, but that is my dad, and he's wonderful. And then I also have a son and 4 grandsons from my adopted daughters. So I couldn't leave the men out. Like it's like I want to give you a really big consensual hug, and say like, come on, like you're so welcome here. And I actually want you in the conversation. I think that we can't have a conversation without you.
Yeah, I think one of the things that really hit me right off the gate, right out of the gate when I was reading your book
Hmm.
is that a lot of the conversation around this subject has created, probably unconsciously or whatever, this us versus them mentality. And that mentality is almost never the right framing to
Yeah.
approach something, especially something as sensitive and as important as consent.
Yeah.
And you blow that out of the water from page 1. It was like, oh, this is different.
Yeah.
And I really appreciated that.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, it was really important to me. And, part of my approach, it's comics, hence consent comics. It's pretty self-explanatory. But the biggest thing that I had to do, and I can, show it here, is I had to figure out a character that I could have in these stories where people weren't like, "Oh my gosh, she's showing these people like this, and this male is doing this." Because honestly, when I think about it, a lot of times when I do see, a pictorial example of consent and it has, the male female dynamic, it already kind of takes me out of it as well, even as a female, because I'm, kind of identifying their features, how they are, and I'm thinking like how much that could realistically be me. And
Mhm.
I think even more so for, men to really be able to join this conversation, I had to make sure that the antagonist wasn't always a male. And I think 9 times out of 10, when you see things, it's most often a male. But the reality is, I think one, that assaults are very underrated, just like they're not as people aren't telling you as much, because with males you have like the this almost like this macho, like, okay, well, I'm not gonna talk about this, or I'm not gonna report this. And the reality is, I think, that there's a lot more assaults on males than we want to even recognize in a society. I know that even in my approach, I had a cousin who was telling me all kinds of stories of these women that have just completely like handled him in ways that were inappropriate.
Yeah.
And he's not going, to a supervisor and saying, "Hey, she just did this to me," right? But, he has every right to, and he, obviously appreciated this approach because he felt like he could just tell me his stories and that I would care, And I
Yeah.
think that's ultimately, what my approach does. It shows like I care about every human being treated the way that they should. I don't care if you're male or female, if you're gay or straight, if you're black or white, like all of those things. I want each and every one of us to feel like we have the space that is, safety around our bodies and ultimately our decisions, regardless of who we are.
Yeah, I think another one of the things that is really harmful about the us versus them dynamic that you so dexterously avoid
Hmm.
is that I mean it's painting boys as the aggressors
Yeah.
or potential aggressors
Hmm.
almost universally. And
Yeah.
how are you going to you're going to get two possible responses from that. Number
Yeah.
one, you're going to browbeat the boy who's reading this into believing that he's a potential aggressor, which isn't,
Hmm.
by the way, that's not a great signal to send that person.
No.
Because the other thing he's going to do is he's going to embrace, well, I guess that's just who I am, and I deserve to
Hmm.
be who I am, and so
Yeah.
I'm just going to embrace the toxicity of it.
Hmm.
And I think that we are seeing, I think that's really the way that the issue has been framed over the last 10 years.
Yeah.
And I think we're seeing the fruits of that right now.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah,
ugly.
no, I have to agree on that. I think as a mother to a son, I wanted to give my son something to grasp that said, look at this, like, of course, in each of my stories, you'll see, a lines crossed version where someone's not respecting a boundary, an apology version where they realize kind of like, oh, I'm starting to pressure someone and I need to, about face and really apologize. And then they see the version of like, this is how you're respectful kind of from the beginning. I wanted my son to know that that was something he could aspire to,
Yeah.
rather than this is who you are and this is who you don't need to be. And I think, and our society, unfortunately, we really are pushing boys to have that mentality of like, just don't do it. And I like to say, like, even Nike gives us a just do it, right? It's a
Right.
positive affirmation. It's not some negative of like, don't be like this, don't be like this, And that's what Consent Comics does. Is I wanted to show people like, this is what you can be like, and this is what we can all strive to be like. And truly, in some ways, depending on where you are, it's a journey, and this is how you get there.
Now, let me so there's a whole other extreme
Hmm.
that you can go to in the in the consent discussion. And I'm reminded of this episode of a show called New Girl, and she grew up in Oregon,
Hmm.
and so she and her boyfriend, they were flashing back to a high school scene with her and her boyfriend, and you could tell that they both really wanted to engage in some physical behavior, but they had to go through this ridiculous and labyrinthine consent ritual,
Hmm.
which was just it was intentionally
Yeah.
ridiculous, but it's almost like, and I mean, that's the other extreme, almost, that in order to make sure that you're crossing all your T's and dotting all your I's with respect to consent, you're destroying all the spontaneity of it.
Hmm.
And I get the sense that you would disagree with that perspective.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
tell me what your thoughts are
Yeah.
about that, and what a healthy vision of mutual consent looks like.
I think in any relationship or situation, there's a progression, right? Of where you start out and kind of where you are currently. My current partner, there was definitely the asking first over and over and over again. But I think that any relationship, there's communication. It's kind of like, I mean, if you take like tea or coffee, my partner no longer has to ask if I want tea or coffee in the morning. It's usually I want some tea or coffee in the morning, right? And so, but I know that if I don't want tea and coffee in the morning, he's not going to say, "Oh my gosh, like I can't believe you. We always do tea and coffee in the morning. So like why are you changing things up on me?" And so, we usually have like conversations, but there still is very much you in any relationship, there's that spontaneity, but it's safe spontaneity.
Yeah.
It's safe in the sense that, no matter what's going on, no matter where we are in whatever situation, I know that my voice still carries weight. And so if I am saying like, "Hey, I don't want to do this," then it's okay, moving on. There's that safety in me saying no whenever I want to say no, and I think that's something that, a married couple even like, right, you're gonna grow into that kind of situation where, as long as you've built that safety, there can be that spontaneity. But I know I can always turn around and say like, no, I'm tired. No, I'm not feeling well. No, I'm not up for it this time. No, I don't want you doing that, and that's really what these comics show is like that the respecting of the no is kind of it's the baseline, and then everything else is like built up on top of that, and once
Yeah.
you have that safety of like there's no consequences whatsoever to my no, then I think everything kind of builds from that, and then you don't have to you can even say I always tell people like you can have a conversation where you say, "Hey, I don't need you to ask me about this anymore." If I'm not feeling it, like I'll let you know that I'm
Yeah.
not feeling it. And that's why I try to stay away from rules, because when you start putting rules in place, then, like people get too nervous to really do anything. And that's where
Mhm.
you get kind of an episode like that, where it's like, oh, and you're so nervous where if you're really caring about someone, you'll do that checking in of like, is it okay, if I do this? And it's just natural. Oh yeah, this is great. Let's keep going. And so I really try to give room for, relationships and growth and there being, fluid moments within those. But always knowing that like, the baseline is I've made it very clear to you and you've made it very clear to me that if you want to say no, it's perfectly fine. If you want to change your mind, it's perfectly fine. All of that is completely good. And that's, I think, really what makes, a sexual relationship or any relationship in any kind of way work when you know that you have the freedom of choice.
I one of the founding kind of reasons for this whole project for me was because I feel like we're in a masculinity crisis.
Hmm.
And the nature of that masculinity crisis is that we're losing sight, our culture is losing sight of a healthy vision of
Hmm.
masculinity. And there's a bunch of reasons that that's happening, and we don't have to belabor them here. But um, and I think that a lot of people struggle to even define healthy masculinity.
Hmm.
But one of the key definitions that I think is very, very important is someone who's exhibiting healthy masculinity makes people feel safe
Right.
and secure.
Right.
That's what a man does,
Yeah.
right? In the healthy masculinity
Hmm.
sense. And the metaphor that I like to use is that of a castle. And your success
Hmm.
as a man, as a healthy masculine person, is defined by the kinds and breadth of activities that can thrive under your domain.
Yeah.
Your castle is large and the walls secure those people, and the
Hmm.
people inside your castle walls feel like they can do what they want to do,
Oh, I
and they're
love that.
free.
Yeah.
That's what it means in my view to be a healthy man.
Hmm.
And that requires not only the ability to set boundaries. You need to
Yeah.
be able to build walls in
Yeah.
order to be a healthy man.
Hmm.
It also requires the ability to respect them.
Hmm. Yeah.
And I mean, nobody I know wants someone to feel unsafe. And yet
Yeah.
we will often engage in activity that has that result.
Yeah.
And so I think one of the things that I really liked about your book, or that I really like about your book,
Yeah.
is that you actually, I mean, it's very geared towards consent in as applied to sexuality.
Hmm.
Consent takes a particular um weight when it comes to
It
sexuality,
does.
right?
Yeah.
Because like consent about here, eat this candy bar. I don't want you. No, you have to try it, right? Like uh, that's still a that's still a kind of violation of the boundary, but it's not
Hmm.
a problem the way
Right.
that sexuality would be.
Hmm.
But you have all these stories that make it clear that these are universal principles. It's not
Yes.
just applied to sexuality. It's also applied to, hey, this kid, this friend of mine made me eat a cake,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And it's the same thing, and it
Hmm.
applies to everybody, and anybody can be a person who's crossing the boundary, and anybody
Yes.
can be a person who's trying to enforce the boundary
Hmm.
in different situations. And that's something that I think is completely absent from most of the discussions around
Hmm.
consent. It
Yeah.
it feels like people are giving a recipe, whereas you're giving a philosophy.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean that's really, I think we're humans, right? You can't, one recipe doesn't fit everybody, and that's really what I didn't want to do. Was I didn't want to make sure I was saying like, here now I'm forcing you to take this in. If anything, I'm giving you a choice because you're reading it, and stories allow for you to interpret it. And I wrote it in a way where you're not going to come away with like, "Ooh, I wanna be someone who, like, never asks anybody what they wanna do," or, like,
Yeah.
I don't wanna be, I don't wanna be that person that respects that boundary that looked, too wonderful, but I'm writing it in a way where you can start seeing yourselves in these stories, and think about it in, like you said, a more broad way, of, like, how am I, how am I when I'm, like, someone in general is telling me they don't want to do something that I want to do. Am I accommodating? Am I like, or am I guilt tripping them? Do I guilt trip them, when I really want them to do something that I want them to do? Am I
Yeah.
someone who withholds some kind of information to trick someone into doing something? For me, I think a lot of times, even we as parents, we have to be careful because I think, when our kids are toddlers and we're at a restaurant and we don't want them to scream and yell, we do a lot of like manipulation for in order to get that to not happen.
Right.
But as they grow older, that needs to we need to allow them to grow, right? And so
Yeah.
like how much are we even manipulating our children, in terms of like, okay, are we trying to control their feelings by, presenting something in a certain way? Or should we allow them to like actually have all of their feelings, and guide them through it? So I think there's just a balancing act. And I'm not saying it's even one or the other. What I'm saying is, this type of approach allows you to just think about those things, and like I said, like you said, build that philosophy within yourself of what does it look like for me to be a consensual partner, a consensual, parent, a consensual friend, a consensual human being toward others. And how can I grow in that space? Just as I want other people to treat me, how am I going to treat them? And so, it's kind of funny because just even in coming on this podcast, I was thinking about, I was talking to a woman, and she said that her book, or she said that like in my book, it was like it made her think about consent in a very different way. And she had always thought about it like as a female, like, okay, am I consenting to something? Because of, because of the approach that we've talked about. And suddenly, like within my book, she started saying, okay, am I, allowing people to consent when I want something? Am I, how often am I asking?
Yeah.
How often am I approaching someone like they have, a choice? And she said it just completely flipped things around for her. And so I think that's what happens when you just lay these stories out. You allow for people to have a much bigger understanding of what consent really is. And then it's almost like you don't even want to use the word consent. You want to use the word, the words healthy relationships and
Yeah.
boundaries and respect, and value, because I think that really consent comics teaches, consent as just valuing other human beings, and safety even. I love that word, because it really is about having these safe relationships. And that doesn't mean you never like step on each other's toes, but it more so is like when you do, that that person actually cares and is going to try and make up for it, and make you feel safe again.
Yeah. I think that, when I think back to to times when I feel like I went along with something that I didn't really consent to,
Mm-hmm.
um, I recognize how difficult it is to say no.
Yeah.
And once you kind of have that realization about yourself, you now get a sort of a different respect
Mm-hmm.
to if somebody says no to you,
Yeah.
like it took a lot of courage for that to happen in a
Right.
lot of cases.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, man, you really need to take a step back.
Mm-hmm.
And what does that mean? Because it takes it takes a great deal of courage to step up and say no and
Yeah.
try to enforce the boundary. And so, like, you still pushing against the boundary is a real problem in that circumstance.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I really like that you even brought that up of like the difficulty of and saying no, because um, you know, I think a lot of times about people when they're like, oh, why didn't they just say no? And then I think about, some of those same people, it's like, depending on what relationship they're in, they realize, oh my gosh, like, okay, when I'm with my mom and she's kind of overbearing and she's pushing this and that, it's actually really hard for me to stick with my no with her, or even say no, because I'm trying to avoid this or that. And the difficulty in saying no is it's very universal. That I don't think anyone has any like all relationships where they're like, oh, I'm good. I tell this person no, I tell that person no. And so it's really good to recognize that. That's actually why in my book, I even have like a resource called The Different Ways People Say No. And it looks like this here. And it's literally just like it has nonverbal no's and verbal no's.
Yeah.
And it's none of those are actually like quote unquote no. It's something like pausing or tensing up or fidgeting or, look, I think one of the ones that people use a lot now is like looking down at your phone, like you just trying to avoid the tension and the conflict, which you don't want to do something. It's also like saying, I don't know. It's saying maybe,
Yeah.
like there's so many ways that we're trying to say no, without saying, the actual word no. And I think when we realize that as human beings, we realize that if anything, you want someone's what I call empowered yes more than you want anything else. It's like, do you really want to do this? Are you sure you're okay with doing this? There's those checking in where you could make sure like I have someone who fully wants to be in this with me rather than someone who I'm okay kind of overlooking all the other signals that say this, and nonverbal communication, there's nothing new about it. Like I remember growing up, like my mom just had to have a look and I knew, okay, I'm going to back out of this room right now. And, I'm done, mom. I'm good.
Yeah.
And so, it's just like, I think, we as humans, we got to remember that like, these aren't new principles. There's nothing new about realizing that someone's saying something without actually speaking it, or someone's dancing kind of around with other words and trying to say something that's hard for them to say. And that's really what I try to get people to understand. Like, we don't have to look at this as just in like a consent bubble. This is in like all of life.
Yeah. I think that some of the pathology around the
Hmm.
way that our culture is handling the way that our culture handled Me Too and some of those other things is really rooted in a kind of cultural illness that we have
Hmm.
around the notion of boundaries and consent more widely, and that the sexual, you know, um, transgressions
Hmm.
that are just the tip of the spear
Yeah.
of what is more broadly just kind of a immaturity around
Right.
setting and respecting boundaries in our culture at large. And part of the resistance that I think that we got from men to Me Too was around or was birthed in the fact that it was part of something broader, and you're not
Right.
addressing the broader thing. You're just addressing the part where I'm at fault.
Right.
You're
Right.
not addressing the part where I'm also a victim.
Hmm.
And I think if we can widen that cultural aperture, if we can have the discussion the way that you're trying to have it, where no, this is a universal thing and it applies to everybody.
Right.
And
Right.
don't you want a willing partner?
Yeah.
Like in everything you do, don't you want someone who's enthusiastic and is beside you and is rowing the same direction, who's freaking
Hmm.
thrilled?
Yeah.
Yeah, you do. So let's just make sure that that's where we always are.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah,
I
I mean, I think that's like it's like, that's a really hard like topic even because, obviously like Me Too, had some, positives that came from it, but I did notice it was like, even the males in my life, they got scared.
Yeah,
They did get scared and it's like as a female, I was definitely cheering on like okay, women feel like empowered to, talk about what's been happening to them,
yeah,
but I do think I almost wanted to see the same enthusiasm, like if a male had come up and said like, "This happened to me,"
yeah.
because, I know even in Hollywood, like, I don't know if you saw that show, I forget what it was called. It was like, oh, Baby Reindeer.
No,
It was on Netflix and it was like really popular recently. And,
yeah, I never saw
he's
that. I
like trying
remember
to
hearing about it.
yeah, so the main character, he basically is drugged and raped,
Yeah,
by a excuse me, by a male producer.
right.
And it's horrific, but it's really highlighting, and this is like based upon his true story. It was highlighting that like that's not that's
It's
not
not
unheard
just
of.
men against women. It's men against men and yeah, and
It
women.
is,
Yeah,
and so and I know of, I have friends who have stories, same thing where I'm like, "Oh my gosh," like, and so for me, it's like I almost wanted to take the Me Too movement and say like, "That's great," but like I wanted to expand it to
yeah,
where, I want males to come forward and to know that they're gonna be cared about too. Because, they're humans, and I know that our society is built in a way where, even in the justice system, it is catered more to males. I'm not gonna like disagree with that, but I do want to make sure that like men know that like, hey, if you come forward like we who are cheering on, all these other people and their bravery, I'm cheering you on too, and
Yeah.
yeah, I feel like it would have been nice to hear more stories of men saying like this happened to me and this, affected me. And I was in this abusive relationship because a lot of times I don't think sometimes they even realize the abuse. I was actually just on a phone call a couple weeks ago with a male pastor. He's a Baptist preacher, and he was in a domestic violent relationship. He
Wow.
was he was the victim in it.
Hmm.
And it's a shame because I'm like, oh, like he was told, just like other, like just like the women in the church, he was told to stay in that relationship. But he ended up getting out eventually, thankfully. But it was just hearing that story, I'm like, we need to see that this isn't just male versus female and female versus male, but this is really just two human beings, right?
Yeah.
And I want people to see that, like, at the very start of it, if we start with the humanity of it all, then I'm hoping that every relationship is affected by learning about consent, because it's geared toward our humanity. It's not geared toward this sex or that sex. And I truly care, like, honestly, thinking about the stories that I know of where men are the victims, and that was the point of, that letter to the guys. Recognize, I mean, we even know about it in with the priests, right?
Yeah.
Priests usually went after the boys,
Right.
unfortunately, right? So those stories break my heart just as much as the stories of the women um that have been victims as well. I don't want anybody to be a victim. Okay? Like, that's just the reality. I don't want anybody to be a victim. I don't care what you look like, and what sex you are. And that's really what I was trying to get at. And so, hopefully when it comes to movements, it's like Me Too can be more of a, all of us too, eventually.
Yeah.
I think it had its place and it has its place, but I would love to see, kind of the male counterpart of that, of like men coming forward as well. Cause like I said, I do think that it is underreported because of, a lot of things that kind of go against the culture of it.
Yeah.
It's not, I mean, I don't know of many stories where men come forward, and this is because this is a really normal story for us as women. We talk about like something that happened with us, and how we were um abused, and our friends just gather around us, and it's really beautiful. And I would love for that to be the norm for males as well, and even if it's like I was in the club and this woman, she started grabbing at me and it made me feel really uncomfortable, like, which would be more so my cousin's story. Or if it was, the preacher's story where he's saying, I was in this relationship, and my wife was cut me with some knives and things like that, and I was told to stay, and we're like, "Oh my gosh." Um, it would just be great to see more of that. There's
I
that
agree.
show right now, Off Campus, and it's showing really great.
Yeah.
And I've started watching some of it because everybody's like, "You got to watch it because of what what your work is." Um, and so I really love what it's showing. And I think
Yeah.
it's kind of showing like more so what my book does. It's like it's showing like what this actually looks like rather than just giving people rules.
Right.
Um, and I haven't finished the show, but I'm like, it would be great if, maybe one of the male characters had a story of abuse as well, and we got an example of what that would look like for men to gather around them, instead of being like, really, come on, you're not happy that she grabbed you, you know.
Yeah.
And that's kind of an aspect of this society that we don't that we don't talk about.
Yeah. I think all of those dynamics that have been brought into such high relief, about women experiencing, um, uh, like sexual transgressions, um, apply m- m- probably even more for men.
Hmm.
I think it's something that most men would view as shameful,
Yeah.
even if when it happened they were children.
Right. Right.
I think that they do not feel like it would be something that they would want in the light, that they would feel supported
Right,
about,
right.
or I mean, and so as a culture, we have a lot of work to do there. And I mean, I think that this philosophy that you're essentially espousing in your book is such a healthy way
Mhm.
to have that discussion. And you're doing God's work with that.
Yeah,
And
thanks.
I'm it really struck me when I first opened the book. I was like, oh, this is a different way of thinking about it, and I really like it.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this: your book is generally geared towards older readers,
Mhm.
a- and I mean it very directly handles the application of the boundaries in and consent in a sexual context.
Yeah.
No, it's not something I could give to my 7-year-old,
No,
right?
yeah, no.
Um, in your opinion, how do we cultivate the skill of setting and enforcing and respecting boundaries in younger children? Or is that even a thing that we should be doing? It seems like
Yeah.
it should. It seems like we should be able to lay the groundwork there.
Mhm.
But how do you think that works?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, for me, because I have I had my kids obviously, and I have my grandkids. I have my 7-year-old grandson, and boundaries right now and relationship dynamics, that is something that we are already approaching
Yeah.
with him. And we talk about, I always tell him, I'm like, Chris, if you had just asked about this first, like that, because for them it's like, okay, I'm gonna do this, and they don't think about that yet.
Yeah.
And so we talk a lot about just asking about this first, even if it's right now, it's like the amount of noise he'll bring to a room that's quiet out of nowhere, and it's like, he's like, you guys are chilling here, so I'm gonna bring in my banjo and just, or I'm gonna start playing. He has a Simon game, and it's so loud.
Yeah.
And he just will start playing it. And I said, Chris, I just need you to ask us, "Hey, do you guys mind if I play this in here?" You kind of have to start reading the room as a kid and realize I can't just bring whatever I want into this space whenever I feel like it. It's good to ask about that. The other thing, that I make sure I always show him is really respecting, his boundaries. So a lot of times, like, I won't always say, like, I think as a parent, like, we realize, like, you're not always going to say, do you want a hug? You know, but I, like, when my kids are upset, I certainly say, like, can I hug you right now? Do you want a hug right now?
Yeah.
And then even with, his privacy, he knows that, like, he can set, like, the different boundaries when he wants to about, like, when grandma, can see him, like, coming out of the bathtub, and when I cannot. And he's just certainly just got to the age where he's like, grandma. And I'm like, all right, so we're there, and next time I'll make sure I knock, and he knows, like, he can kind of grow into even, his boundaries and his independence. And so I think it's a kind of a constant, showing of, like, respect, and how do you show respect with him. And he's slowly getting it, less so with the room and all the noise, but he does understand, like, just like, his autonomy and other people's autonomy, but we're not using the word autonomy yet,
Yeah. Yeah. One of the really clear principles that has come out of this work for me is the fact that stuff has to be modeled as opposed to explained. And
Right.
you can explaining is a way of helping people understand what was modeled,
Hmm.
and then it can take root.
Yeah.
And so I always search for ways to 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 model that, or to, when you're trying to create the lesson, to try to figure out how to model it. And
Yeah.
I love this framing that you have of even this making noise in a quiet room thing
Yeah.
is an exercise in boundaries and consent.
Hmm.
And even that is an opportunity to model both the a way of enforcing the boundary. Hey, Chris, like, we're all in here enjoying our peace and quiet in here, and you just
Yeah.
came in and did this. That's fine that you want to do that. There's nothing wrong with wanting to do that, but you need to ask first.
Mhm.
Um, and in this case, we're probably going to say no, and we're going to give you an alternative.
Right, right. We usually say you can go into the living room.
Yeah, and go crazy in there. Well, yeah, and that's
Yes.
okay too. There is
Yeah.
nothing wrong, and there's kind of a shame reaction that they might have. I mean, if you have the normal reaction of Chris, quiet down. What are you doing? Like
Yeah.
that's shame producing, and that is
Mhm.
not a valuable that is not a valuable tool.
Exactly.
That is a tool that is more likely going to drive people away and drive people into a place where that behavior is lauded,
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
opposed to, as opposed to not. And
Mhm.
and so, like, I don't know. I don't. Actually, let me ask you that question. What do you think the role of shame, if any, is in this topic?
Yeah. Gosh, that's a really good question. Because first I wanted to say there's no role whatsoever.
Yeah,
Um,
that's my hypothesis, but I think
yeah.
that we're running up against the boundaries here of
Mhm.
where it might. Yeah, I'm
Yeah. I
seeing
mean,
it. Yeah,
obviously, like, we're human, right? So, like, I could I can give you an answer, but I'll probably be thinking about this for a week,
yeah,
you know, and then I might land somewhere a little bit different.
yeah.
But I do think sometimes shame has a role in, um, societal shame. I will say that societal shame can have a role in changing a behavior, maybe like changing a behavior for someone who's like doesn't care otherwise. Um, but I think even then there's a delicate balance of like, is there something for them to turn to after they're like, oh gosh, you're right. That was a really terrible thing for me to do. And how could I do that? Because we can't land in shame. You can't have someone just stay in shame. What is that going to do for anybody? That's not going to change anything.
That's right.
So, I would say like if, I actually have there's a group that I support. It's a domestic violence shelter. And they recently started a program that was called, well, I won't say the name because I don't want to like give away which place it was
Fair enough.
and have people look this up. Because even they said this program is new, but we're recognizing, especially because within abusive relationships, on average, it takes someone 7 times before they will actually leave. And
Mhm.
so they started a program for the abuser. And it's a very intense it's therapy, it's, a lot of teaching. But it's really trying to get them to understand what it is that they have been doing, maybe where that comes from, because their belief is nobody is born an abuser. So these things that they're doing, they came from somewhere. Can we unearth it and figure this out, especially for those relationships where, and they would usually work with women, but they also say they have men that come to their shelter, you know, but where this abuser got these issues from, and can we, try and help them like, figure it out for themselves so that they can stop. And of course, these people come because they want to stop. And, I think one of the things that they do feel in coming is, and especially once they realize what they've been through, is it's kind of like the opposite of a survivor. A lot of times when we realize what we've been through, and the realities of it, like that, then our shame kind of like breaks because we're like, wow, this is just terrible for anybody to go through, and nobody deserves this. Um, but I think on the flip side, they start feeling that shame, right? But this program uses that shame and, has them like go through it. And obviously, I can't ever say, I don't know if they're like, get free of that shame later on, but, I do think in some ways maybe shame has its place, but, not here. You will get no shame here. you know,
Yeah, yeah.
that was not the role of this. This is the place this is what you read after you feel ashamed and you're like, I really want to change.
Yeah, I like that
Okay. What are
answer.
your
I
thoughts?
really struggle. This is one of my hobby horses.
Yeah.
Is I wonder what the appropriate role of shame is. And
Right.
one thing I do know is, as a weapon, it is really overused.
Yeah. I agree with that.
And I actually haven't encountered a situation in my personal life where it was the right thing to do.
Hmm.
It wasn't the right thing for me to be ashamed.
Yeah.
or the right thing for me to impose shame on somebody else to try to make someone else feel that way.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, and the bottom line is one of the truths there is that only people capable of feeling shame will actually feel shame.
That's true.
And you by it's like an antibiotic. You will
Mhm.
actually create super bugs, people who are immune to shame as a result
Mhm.
of trying to apply and to misapply it.
Yeah, no,
And I
I
think
can
we're
see that.
seeing in our culture a lot of that.
Yeah. Yeah, because sometimes the shame doesn't even it
Yeah.
doesn't affect people at all, you
Yeah,
know?
exactly. Yeah, because,
Yeah.
I mean, it's especially people who are very hyper online, there's, a lot of that, right? I mean, it's just
Mhm.
and so you just kind of roll your eyes. Okay, here's, another snowflake telling me about what a jerk I'm being by
Yeah.
some relatively minor thing. And then the transgressions get greater and greater to where
Mhm.
it's not a minor thing anymore. And
Yeah.
I think that's the mechanism. I wish that happens, but yeah, I don't know. It's interesting to think about. Well, I always
Yeah.
like to end these conversations by asking a similar question to everybody, and I'm really
Okay.
interested to hear your viewpoint. And I know I'm putting you on the spot, but that's part of the fun,
Yeah, no, that
and it's part of
I'm
the way
game.
you get such a great response. But if there is one principle that you
Mhm.
think every parent listening should live by when raising their kids, what would it be?
Ooh, you know what? This is good timing because it was just Father's Day,
Yes.
and I was just thinking about what it is that my dad did with me to make me feel so safe with him. Like I said, after I went through what I did, he was actually the first parent that I called and opened up to.
Yeah.
And so I think, thinking about like what it was that he was doing with me growing up, he showed me that he was willing to adjust. Like there was never any rigidity when it came, to like when it came to how he approached me. He was always willing to learn and listen and adjust. And adjusting, I felt like, I was being supported for who I was and am as opposed to who he might want, might be trying to help me grow into, And so, just not feeling like I was always getting, hitting a brick wall, but feeling like I had someone who was willing to like learn, who I was and parent me in those ways that I needed, as opposed to what he might have thought.
Yeah, was that a surprise to you that he was as supportive as it is? You must have known. I mean, you chose him, and so you must have known at some level that it was likely to turn out well.
What do you mean with?
Well, I mean, his. You mentioned your dad's reaction
Mhm.
was to be adaptive and to
Yeah.
really see you for who you were, and he was really supportive in that. Did you expect that was going to be the result, or was that a surprise to you?
You know what? It was kind of a surprise to me because, just like no matter what the relationship is, it just takes a lot to open up to anyone
Sure.
with your story. And so I think honestly, here I am years later, I've realized why more so than like knowing why I was going to him.
Hmm.
It was just like now I look back and I'm like, okay, I learned things from that where I'm like, no wonder he felt safe. But, I didn't it wasn't like something within me. I think, there was a part of it where it broke because honestly, the story is he had just spent like a week with me and he knew something was off. He
Mm.
said, and the way he describes it as a dad, like, he was hugging his daughter and she was suddenly not there, and so he knew something was off. And I wasn't opening up.
Mm.
And then he literally is driving away and I call him and I couldn't do it face to face. And I finally called him and I said, like, Dad, he did some things to me. And he's like, I
Uh,
knew it. And he's like, you know what this means, don't you? And I was like, no, he's like, it means I'm turning around,
yeah.
And then he literally just came and he spent like a week with me just to be
Wow.
there. He wasn't asking me questions, like he was just trying to be there. And so, yeah, I'm trying not to tear up because
Yeah.
that's like one of those stories where I'm like, that will always live with me, like when it comes to, like you said, that safety.
Yeah.
He built that castle. He was that safety for me.
Yeah. That's
And so like
masculinity.
when I really needed that safety, like I couldn't help but go to it eventually.
What a great story.
Yeah. So hurrah for like all you dads out there trying to be
Yeah.
that safe space.
Yeah. Good job. Good job.
Yeah.
Good job, Tiffany's dad. So where can Tiffany, where do people go to learn more about you and your work?
hmm Yeah. So, I mean, I have a website, consentcomics.com. You can buy the book on Amazon, bookshop.org, and Barnes and Noble. And I even saw that it was on eBay, but don't do that because they're just trying to resell it for like really expensive. I don't know what that's about. But, you can go there. I also have an Instagram. I am Tiffany Braxton, as well as TikTok and all those other things. But I really, more than anything, like the best place is just to start in the book. Because like I can describe it all day, but until you experience it, you don't see, you can't see and know what it is that you'll get from it. And I
Yeah.
can't even tell you because a lot of times, like I said, like that woman who was like, I always thought about consent just in terms of my consent, like I never expected to get that story from someone,
Yeah.
but I get so many stories of just people seeing different things, or it's like even my friend who has like an 11-year-old girl and this girl has just been reading through it over and over again, and just, loves it. And I'm like, okay, I love that for her. And how great is it that an 11-year-old girl has this in her back pocket already,
That's
you
right.
know?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I just really recommend that you pick up the book and truly share it with whoever you think will be helped by it. I have a problem with honestly giving it away, because I was like, I just gave it away to one of the, women at the domestic violence shelter, right? Because I know that, whatever it is that they need, they can probably find it within these stories. And so, yeah, that's really, like all I have to say is like, buy the book, but, whatever it is that, you're looking for, I'm sure, you'll find it in some way in these stories or you'll find it for someone else.
Yeah. I definitely second that. It's
Yeah.
yeah, it is, everybody needs help.
Right.
Um Learning how to set and enforce boundaries and respect boundaries in a
hmm
healthy way.
Yeah.
And this book is a really great way to help you.
Yeah.
I really yeah. So and the links to all of these things are in the show notes to this episode. Tiffany, thank you so much for just opening up your world to this. It's a tough conversation to have in a lot of
hmm
ways, and you make it easy, and I really
Yeah.
appreciate you.
Yeah, I'm so glad that I make it easy. I try to, I'm just honestly, I'm just like a high school, teacher still trying to be like as cool as she can to each and every person that she meets so that they gain like whatever knowledge I'm trying to, approach with them. So sometimes that comes off as like corny, but no matter what, I always try to make sure like people know, like even with what you were bringing up, right? Like some of those were like sticky topics, but I'm very open to always discussing the sticky topics because if we don't, who's going to or who's going to be thinking about that? And it's never prescriptive for me. It's like, have your own thoughts and work through them on your own. I'm not going to tell you what to do or what to think.
Yeah, I love it. Well, Tiffany, thanks again to everybody listening. Thank you for listening to Raising Men. You are a great parent. Raising Men is produced by Fiel Hernandez. This episode was edited by Ralph Tolentino.